friends and comrades, and welcome back indeed to another video on the MCP channel. Now, no doubt if you're being into Marxism, Leninism, Marxism thoughts, you will have come across the word materialism. But I think sometimes, because of the way we use the word material colloquially, the word is, as a philosophy, is very misunderstood. And you will get to a certain point where people, from their misunderstanding of the word material, will misunderstand the implications of the philosophy of materialism and start to say things like, well, the spirit isn't material, God's not material, so, you can't be religious and a materialist. This is completely wrong, so I wanted to talk to you today about what materialism means and how materialism relates to the spiritual. Fundamentally, materialism is quite simply the philosophy that reality exists independent of human thought. Materialism as opposed to what then? Materialism as opposed to idealism. Idealists believe that thought comes first and that the world itself is actually shaped by your mind. In its extreme forms such as solipsism, it is the belief that the world in fact is only real insofar as it exists in our minds, never mind just shaped by it. And there are also extreme forms of materialism, such as vulgar French materialism, which espouses that there is nothing real in the world beyond matter, and that the thoughts and consciousness that we have are reducible to mere electrochemical phenomena occurring mechanically in the brain. Marxists reject vulgar materialism, although the mind and thoughts are still shaped by the conditions we live in, but this does not mean that matter is the only thing that counts. We absolutely must dissociate from the idea that materialism is the view that everything that exists is made up from entities that must be able to be observed physically. It is far better to refer to this as physicalism. Materialism instead should be understood as contrary to idealism, which is the denial of the independent existence of the world revealed through our sense perception. Materialism then, to be clear, is merely the view that the world, which can be accessed through the senses, but also from those observations abstracted to find other truths that aren't sensible, but that this world does independently exist outside of any human consciousness about it. Some philosophers like to refer to this idea by the name of realism instead. This applies to the existence of the independent physical world indeed, but also things like the existence of things that we can't physically see, like mathematical objects or truth or causality. And if we want to talk about Marx, he was a realist about certain social structures and causality, and he believed that there are certain laws of motion and such to capitalism. Materialism is always concerned with the material object, beyond what labels, forms or appearances describe. This material object is not necessarily physical or mechanical. It refers to some consistent, underlying symptom that exists regardless of how it is presented or looks, or what it is called. Theologically, it's rather like how Catholics use the words substance and accidents, which could be roughly equated to material object and formal appearance, respectively. It is the belief that appearance and essence are not always the same thing, but there is always some objective and external essence of a thing we must acknowledge, and that this is not determined by our will, but exists regardless of it. The material content, as opposed to what? As opposed to the apparent, the inessential, and the superficial. I've actually found that Catholics tend to understand that things can appear but intrinsically be different very well. I mean, as this is quite literally transubstantiation. Upon the altar and the Mass we see the appearances of bread and wine, but in fact substantially it is the body, blood, soul and divinity of Christ. Materialism's truth is demonstrated in its ability to prove scientific, concrete results. The assumption of the existence of an objective, external reality allows one to draw conclusions from observations based upon sense experience, rather than endlessly debating to whether or not the observations are even real. Idealists, on the other hand, attempt to superimpose some sort of narrative onto reality, treating the material objects as if it is premised by some ideal form. It is the assumption that reality is already always identical to their perception of it, since after all, they believe that their mind determines reality. Though it primarily concerns itself with analyses that are, stemming from the physical world as a specialist area of study, materialism is not physicalist. Materialism is not incompatible with a belief in more than the physical existing. The main point of importance is a mindset of objective reality. We have said before that the man who believes in the objective physical universe, but also an objective metaphysical existence of God, is far more of a materialist than an atheist who thinks that their mind can shape reality. For example, both an atheist or a Catholic, if they believe in conforming to external objective reality, are likely to respond in the same way to the transgender issue. Just an example. The distinction between them, then, is merely quantitative, not qualitative, as the Catholic will believe in more things, a greater quantity of things that are existing in that objective reality, and although the specific content of it is up for debate between the friends, the mindset and outlook is actually consistent between them. Whether there is actually an external objective reality is not what's up for question, only the distinct things existing therein. These are questions for investigation and argumentation, but can be done so from a consistent philosophical and methodological perspective, which is what is important. To say a belief in God is contrary to materialism is to make the false equivalence of the material object with physical matter, when really material object is referring to just a common symptom. If the religious comrade believes in an objective existence of God in reality, i.e. God isn't just in the head to him, he's actually asserting God to be a material object. The debate then is thus just a question of whether a particular thing exists in material reality, and it's not unlike having a discussion about the existence of a certain distant planet, for example. Debating the merits of the various evidence does not make either man any less of a scientist, or a materialist if you will. What would be contrary to materialism if someone was to argue that there was a planet that is shaped and changed by our thought out there? Yes, that would be contrary to materialism. But very, very few religious comrades are trying to argue that the existence of God is something subject to or determined by human thought. Therefore, even for comrades who disagree about the claim itself about God actually existing or not, it is still entirely impossible for them to exist consistently alongside a materialist mode of thinking. It may go beyond what most materialists perceive as being the content of material reality, but it is not contrary to it, as it is still very much holding to the idea of a reality unaffected by our mental processes, which is the main point. However, even the physicists who might disagree on the existence of a given distant planet, because they have the same outlook and methodology, when they are working on a problem closer to home, it has no bearing on their methods or results. They could look at the same mechanics problem on Earth and come to the same answer. So too, even if our comrades hold differing views to as whether metaphysical phenomena exist in material reality or not, all comrades acknowledge that there does exist an objective material reality, and that the physical is certainly a part of that reality, whether or not they believe there's more. Therefore, when dealing with questions that pertain only to the physical, which is the vast majority of this party's work, the thinking between the members is going to follow the exact same process. Here is a diagram of acceptable positions in the party. Every party member must believe the physical is real. It is also acceptable to believe that the physical is real and the metaphysical is real. It's not possible to say that the physical is not real and the metaphysical is real. and it is absolutely unacceptable to say that nothing is real, everything's in the head, or reality is determined by thought. Marx himself acknowledges religion as the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions, which means religion is, even physically if you like, interfacing with our humanity, with the essence of man. Marx claims that the insight of German idealism is that, quote, man is the highest essence of man. And this means that, like, as we say, even mechanically, if you want to be physicalist about it, there is a significance to religion. Now, Marx never claims to know what the essence of man is, by what form we relate to our essence as human beings. So this also does not necessarily restrict religion to merely being understood as a sociological phenomenon, as such figures as Freud and Jung like to do, who just enjoy simply observing the physical and mechanical effects of religion, but they never seriously engage with it as possibly being true. They just want to assess its impact in this world, if you will. But what we are saying is, as a materialist, it is entirely possible to entertain the claims of religion as they're intended to be, of being real, and this would simply give a more profound meaning to what is the essence of man. And if it was the case that religion was part of reality, well, it would be material too, and we would be participating in the material reality, and therefore it cannot be said to be anti-materialist. We really must drill down to what man really entails. Because if not all that is material is necessarily physical, which we've already established, then man here doesn't necessarily just refer to his mechanical physical body. And we know that Marx believes there's more to man than a mechanical body. He talks about things like our species essence, which I'll come back to that later. But if we consider, for instance, the greater problem with the modern day practice of psychology, which does attempt to encapsulate all of man inside of the physical, it would seem like empirical science is not a good way to analyse that which is not physical and cannot be physically experimented upon, such as mental processes. How can you demonstrate something relating to psychology such as justice or morals empirically? It is not possible. Most people make an error because they consider the term science just to be synonymous with the empirical method. But this is not so, and that is just one of a plethora of methods, all being scientific. And Marxism is not an empirical science. It's a political science, it's a philosophical science, a social science. So perhaps before trying to study something scientifically like human mental processes or the essence of man, it is useful to have an understanding of what science is. Science is simply having a knowledge of a thing through its causes. This could be attained through various means for the different respective sciences. Certainly, for empirical science, direct observation is a reliable way to discover the causes of something. But this is not so for philosophical sciences, where a great majority of the time the thing in question cannot be taken out and experimented upon, but the science is still based upon observations and reasoning on that basis, but there's room for abstraction there, and in fact that's necessary, and Marx does this with economics. I'll talk about that in a minute. There are many things that exist that cannot be physically experimented on, but very few people would deny their existence, such as mathematics. So with this understanding, a deductive explanation of an a priori phenomena that also included the supernatural would in fact be considered more scientific than randomly formulated set of groupings of observations without explanation just concerning the natural. Just because something only concerns the physical or the natural doesn't make it more scientific. Like I said, mathematics, for example, is a far more scientific system than scattered observed data with no coherent explanation. But mathematics is not physical. Something is not scientific because it provides a natural physical reason for something, but rather is scientific if a thing is properly known through its causes. Whilst indeed from studying a man's outward behaviour, you can know certain things are there, we can never get any closer to understanding why that is so. When discussing psychology, and note we're not talking about neuroscience or brain surgery, which is physical, the formal object of study when we're talking about the mind contains that which is simply not physical, and thus empirical science will always be insufficient in explaining and will reach a cut-off point of sorts where it can no longer find any causes. We find this a lot in the work of Freud and Jung, for example, when they just arbitrarily claim that a certain behaviour is innate or part of a human condition without considering why or what that might suggest. So for the example with Freud, he realises that man has a sense of guilt and a longing for God, a desire to offer sacrifices is observed anthropologically, and a curiosity towards what will happen after he dies is present throughout different societies. But because Freud will not entertain any phenomena beyond the physical world, he cannot see that it could point towards the supernatural, a desire inside us to react and know God, come clean before him, and a sense of greater meaning beyond the earthly life. Instead, Freud dismisses all of that, without even looking at it seriously, because how could it be true if it's not physical? In doing so, he ends up trying to bend over backwards to make such simple observations into purely naturally, physically explained occurrences, to much perverse result, as I'm sure you're all aware. Even still though, Freud, and later Jung, both get to a point where they just cannot explain any further and just have to make some random philosophical assumption. For example, Freud has to say all of this is caused by the Oedipus or Electra complex, but we cannot explain that further, he just posits it and expects us to trust him. Likewise for Carl Jung and his archetypes, he just says religion can be explained by them, but never explains the archetypes themselves. This is a great flaw in the reasoning of these empiricists, and it shows that they're not empirical at all, because what they're studying is something that can't be studied empirically. It's as philosophical as religion, but with less grounding, basically. In their attempts to naturalise everything, it seems like they gloss over more obvious but metaphysical explanations, and construct complex webs of imaginative but purely naturalistic and physical explanations, which at their roots rely on assumptions whose existence can never be proven empirically, but also lack any of the metaphysical, philosophical grounding or reasoning. The cornerstone to Freud and Jung's research relies on putting absolute faith in these gentlemen's subjective theories, which ultimately are as metaphysical as God, but lack any of the same proof as him. Is one supposed to put total trust in the universality of such things without even having experienced any sort of Oedipus complex himself? Or how does he accept that God is the universal archetype imprinted on everyone's mind, if indeed there are atheists? If these assumptions are not true, then these blokes' entire theories fall down, and the inability to engage with deductive reasoning but holding to an a priori thing still means that you get left with subjective and arbitrary judgments which hold no more weight than yours or mine. Hardly scientific, definitely not empirical. I think this raises the greater question of whether then we should even be approaching the study of what is meant by the essence of man, as Marx says, with empirical science, or whether we should be employing philosophical science, for which I argue the latter would be more effective to provide us with a knowledge of the thing's causes. When dealing with what is not physical, as arguably a large part of the essence of man isn't, any empirical method is always going to be insufficient. And eventually you get to a point where you just have to say, you make up some random archetype and you say, that's just the way it is and you've just got to trust me. At which point it becomes a priori and is not based on physical empirical science anyway. This method is simply not suitable for explaining the essence of man, and certainly not religion. perhaps we should actually engage with religion on its own terms, consider the possibility of it being real, and be open to deductive reasoning and philosophical science based upon some initial observations, sense experience, and reasoning therefore. We're open to that very much so in mathematics. It's the exact same process. This is the only way to get explanations beyond why man has such tendencies, instead of just getting stuck at the point where you just have to say that something is a part of our human nature or innate, which is idealism. That's what the idealists say. You know, a free market is innate, capitalism is part of our human nature, greed is intrinsically, is not shaped by social conditions, it's just intrinsically part of us, and they just posit that a priori, no reasoning. So we have to ask, why is that a part of our nature? Why do we inherit this? If it is a consistent symptom, yeah, that could be true. We could consistently be feeling guilty or what have you, but you can't just randomly just make up this Oedipus Electra-complex thing and say, alright, trust me, bro. I mean, what if you've never even experienced this complex? These are just all questions left unanswered by Freud and Jung, and to begin to understand man's true mental situation, we need to look beyond the physical, and this in no way comes into contradiction with being a materialist. This is how, as materialists, we can understand the essence of man in a scientific manner, but not a physicalist manner. Only then can we discuss things like the irascible and concupiscible appetites, the human being composed of body and soul, subjecting emotion to the intellect, the clouding of reason for original sin, truth, free will, etc. None of those things you're going to be able to see under a microscope. Until that point, though, we will forever be stuck with studying effects and never uncovering causes, and will be trapped in the mere sociology of religion. And the phrase, man is the highest essence of man, will entail nothing more than just the worship of his physical body as some kind of idol, which is not what Marx is getting at, I do not believe. It's a far more profound point than that. The claim of Marxists, in fact, is that by religion being reduced to ideas, and sort of empty Platonic forms, it is the process of it being corrupted with worldly interests, and then the authentic source of religious belief lying inside of man, and the way in which religion interfaces with material reality, with some kind of deeper material object, was lost because it's just all reduced to ideas. It's when there's actually fundamental material reality. The idealists almost make religion into a matter that exists only within the mind, but that actually undermines the deeper reality of religion. And this is what materialists are saying. Remember, material is used in a way that means essential. Hence, communists are opposed to the way, of course, in which religion has been utilised to serve worldly ends and the interests of the ruling class. But the point is, this perversion is actually a betrayal of religion in the material sense. The object of all spiritual questions is material. Does that sound like a contradiction to you? Well, it shouldn't. Spiritual and material are not opposites, but the spiritual reality, if you believe in it, and the earthly reality are both parts of the material reality. It is not unlike the belief of the divine law, natural and human law, all ultimately participating in the eternal law that Catholics hold. In fact, the order of this eternal law is the very essence of what material reality means, because it's the objective and external order of creation in the mind of God, right? The object of religion is material. Material doesn't mean matter. Curiously, the communist position here actually opens up the possibility of a more authentic encounter with the spiritual, as it should probably be as part of material reality, as part of our essence of man, not just empty ideas, and not just a tool for the ruling class. Indeed, historically, the atheists were the rich, noble aristocrats who would often still pay lip service to religion, but didn't even authentically believe in it. They thought that they became God. It is the rich who became corrupt and nihilistic and believed in nothing, and they were humbled by the poor who were kept to their religion authentically because they were connected to the material basis of religion deep within inside them, the inside of their essence of man. One only needs to recall something like the conflict between the Jesuit missionaries trying to teach authentic Catholicism and the interests of the ruling class coming into conflict in Spain. Comrades, earnestly combat the anti-Marxist physicalism of vulgar materialism. It is precisely not dialectical materialism. Marx, in formulating dialectical materialism, sublated a contradiction that existed between Hegel's idealism in Germany and the French vulgar materialism, and it's the reconciliation of these two things. So it's not about purely being ideal or in the mind or the mind shaping reality, and it's not about only the physical existing, it's the sublation of both of these two things. Marx actually makes the claim that there is something about material reality itself that gives rise to spirits and reflection, etc., and that is part of the essence of man. It attests to a deeper truth at the heart of material being itself. Marx identifies this as humanity, the essence of man. What is the essence of humanity? Marx talks about humanity as the essence of man, but what actually does this entail? We must take a non-dogmatic view on this because it is very open-ended and there is room for ambiguity here. Marx says that we cannot ascribe predefined form to man because man must be discovered. The real essence of man could conceivably come or participate with the divine. God, then, is not some sort of idealistic snapshot of a human mind, but is a fundamental, metaphysical, material essence. Marx ascribing the highest essence of man as being man is not something which necessarily rules out religion. It would be if man was only physical, because he'd be saying, well, the best we've got is just physical man. But Marx isn't a physicalist. The question must be asked of what man is. For Marx, this is some more fundamental devotion through which we acquire our humanity. And of course, a large part of this is expressed in your devotion to your fellow man. However, arguably to really be devoted to your fellow man requires some relation to the divine. What speaks more powerfully than this? The incarnation of God himself as man. And in fact, this is actually the very reason that Hegel preferred Christianity out of all religions, because God is becoming man. God is related, is in a very material sense to the essence of man. Physically in that sense, in the sense of the incarnation. So what does material mean? The material is the real, the essence, the real content, the real reality behind the form. The form is temporal and transient. Material is the same thing as essence. In Western sort of individual Cartesian philosophy, material has been confused with physical, which means something that is materiality but already latent with a form. Material instead, though, refers to the mystical and the real, not a form, but something necessarily indescribable in the terms of form. That is what the material symptom is, this common thing that we can't describe in terms of appearance or idea. Taken to its ultimate logical conclusion, this can actually be seen as being the very same as divinity, or as stated before, this eternal law, the order in the mind of God, because it is simply the real, the objective, not something God made, but what is very, very much identical with God's unchanging reason and his idea, his desire for creation. I mean, divinity, after all, is that which is irreducible to any form. It's just pure being. It is pure materiality. That is why we cannot worship idols, because what do the idols do? They attempt to encapsulate all of God in an appearance, in a form, but the materiality cannot be It cannot be reduced to a form. So in this sense, God, divinity, is material, is pure materiality. Materialism has never been about a belief in only the physical, nor has much science at all. There's no way to simply look down a microscope and see that mathematics exists without abstracting from a physical reality, yes, from observations you make and you trust your senses, you observe on sense experience, but you make abstractions and you abstract from physical reality and you hence develop a science of quantities. Quantities exist in nature but are not physical. But nevertheless, they are material objects, and who in their right mind denies that the universe is governed by these mathematical laws? The error of vulgar materialism is the a priori denial of anything that is not physical without sufficient reason. It's totally irrational. In fact, Karl Marx himself analysed value in the same way as Aristotle actually, as depending on the human relation of exchange, which is not physical. It's just not. Value cannot be seen under a microscope. It cannot be empirically observed. But yet this doesn't prevent Marx from being a materialist. Another example could be seen in Marx's theory of alienation. I talked about this a bit before, because this is actually an extremely mystical concept. At its very core is this essential notion of species being, the essence of an organism, the essence of man if you will, that distinguishes it from other living things. And Marx says work is humanity's species being, as opposed to animals who only satisfy immediate needs. Man works beyond them, and this separates him from animals and is part of a spiritual drive, because his consciousness develops and is not necessarily physical, but interacts with the physical, of course, interacts from production and organisation and labour, etc. But Marx and Engels say in the German ideology, man can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence. Of course, in bourgeois society, where the product of his labour doesn't belong to him, but becomes this object entirely independent of production, and work is perverted, losing its uniquely human character, and becoming something purely about the subsistence and about maintaining your life. But then in this way, you're acting like an animal, just fulfilling your immediate survival. The evil of alienation is that it forces man, this spiritual being, to behave like animals. And that's straight from Marx, very mystical. You see, Marx, people make him into something he's not. He's not this sort of cold, physicalist, anti-humanity, sort of Malthusian guy. He's concerned with the ultimate manifestation of human potential. This is a spiritual drive, yet it is still material, and Marx is very much still a materialist. But he is concerned with things like commodity fetishism, and he sees the evil in it replacing people in social relations and alienating man from man. This is the power of the commodity dehumanizing society. Marx is concerned with this. He's concerned with humanity because of the reasons relating to being, spirit, and the unique features of man's soul as opposed to animals. The physicalist would not be interested in any such distinction. Species being requires the belief that man has some sort of innate, God-given if you like, essence. There is actually a proper state for human beings, and a way he ought to be, essential within himself. The separation from his nature is alienation. How can you possibly see such a nature empirically? It is just not possible. So Marx, in a very real sense, was a Heideggerian before Heidegger, because he also asserts the primacy of being very explicitly. Material being. But what is material? Well, we know now it is the essential, the content, not just the physical. not dead facts, not dead sense impressions. Materialism is what actually is, a deeper understanding of being. Why then do we see this vulgar materialist, physicalist error arising if it would condemn even Marx? Well, as we know, much of the left today, unfortunately, is very morally lax and doesn't like to be told otherwise, and hates notions of discipline. They have a horse in the race, if you will, since deep down they know that they must deny anything that is not physical, otherwise it leads to morality, scary normative statements, and them having to do hard things in life instead of pursuing a reckless, hedonistic lifestyle like they do at present. It really is very childish and pathetic. Socialism is not the lack of restraint, or just this freeing from obligation to be one great big hedonistic orgy. It's not a question of rigid capitalism that represents order and discipline, and lax socialism which represents a lack of restraint and ability to do whatever you want. We are tankies, authoritarian socialists. We believe in order. The left seems to think that it's a good idea to ground their psychological appeal in some promise to remove rules, duties and obligations. I mean, not only does this attract an awful demographic because they all are in it for themselves and their own pleasures, but it's not even a good strategy, because now what is happening is the bourgeoisie is already allowing this within the framework of capitalism in order to mitigate the threat of a challenge to the mode of production on that basis, as was seen in the French Revolution when the bourgeoisie of that time had used this very same strategy. They allowed people to unleash their aggressive and sexual impulses and passions, and they used that to overturn feudalism and the chaos. So the bourgeoisie know how that's worked, because they use that to get into power in the first instance. So they're not even going to allow it to work for the left, because basically now they just allow people to unleash their impulses anyway and keep capitalism intact. Hence, what we are seeing capitalists doing now is the maintenance of the economic order, but at the same time the total destruction of the moral order. In the UK, we have a so-called Conservative Party that supports gay marriage and transgenderism, etc., all of that kind of thing. This is because they are conservative in an economic sense only, but totally as degenerate and lax as leftists, morally and socially speaking. In fact, the term conservative isn't really that good to use because it's somewhat relative. You have to have something to conserve. And morally speaking, much of our societies unfortunately have very little left to conserve indeed, and actually introducing a new moral era will be a revolutionary overturn, much like Mao banning prostitution, concubines and homosexuality in the marriage law. It was certainly not a conservative policy. It wasn't continuing the status quo of Imperial China by any means. It was in fact a rupture from the past, but for a more moral era of monogamy, faithfulness and heterosexuality. In fact, Has from Infrared actually spoke very well on this idea that Marxism seeks just a total freedom to act on every whim that crosses one's mind. Marx is not Aleister Crowley, who says, "Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." This is not what Marx's free association refers to. Rather, it is talking about a more organic form of human interaction, as opposed to the estrangement that has existed in the capitalist states which superimpose themselves onto society. Free association is more like a grassroots, bottom-up way for social intercourse to happen, not unlike what was seen actually in the Cultural Revolution. In no way does this have anything to do with each individual just doing as they want, as hedonistic slobs like Vauch would wish to make free association out to be. The idea of regulating desires adhering to customs and rules and traditions, will persist in socialism. Lax people just want to shoehorn being able to fulfill their own perverted fantasies and attribute it to that wise man with the beard. This is why they deny anything that isn't physical, because they tremble at the notion of morality, and the concept that morality and duty may exist may apply to them, and it means that they can't just do whatever will give them the next big dopamine hit. But our conclusion is that if Marx can observe physical things and abstract and reason upon that basis in order to deduce the truth of certain non-physical things which cannot be empirically observed, and yet can still be properly called a materialist, so too can our religious comrades who make certain observations based on sense experience and apply deductive reasoning on that basis in a scientific manner. This is why our party rejects the notion that a belief in God is necessarily idealism. This notion assumes that the religious comrades think God is given existence because of mankind's thoughts, as if we create things because we think them and then they are so. Yes, this would be idealism, I agree, but I also say that very few religious individuals believe this. I think it is a strawman of their position. The religious believer is not saying that God actually exists simply because of his own faith in God. And in fact, faith is not just the irrational blind belief solely rooted in the mind. It is scientific confidence. Now, whether you think they have wrongly arrived at this faith based on the evidence is up to you. But this confidence is built on numerous sensible observations that are believed to demonstrate God's necessity. You can go and check out St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, the cosmological argument, the design argument, all of these kind of things. They're the sensible experience to which reason is applied, and God is the conclusion. If you think the process is wrong, that's fine, but nevertheless it is a belief that God objectively exists. It is not the belief that God is given existence by the mind, which would be a problem and which would be idealism. There is a caricature of religion being this primitive notion of the quote-unquote God of the gaps, whereby, if you can't explain something with science, the poor primitive people will just attribute it to this silly superstitious God. Well, most religious people actually think the contrary. They actually think that all the good arguments for theism in fact take qualities we can see and observe, reason on that basis, and then show how God can be the only logical answer. Faith, theologically, is a trust in God. And the word faith, in a more general sense of the word, it is a trust that we have in other people or things. Just as you have faith and confidence that when you board a plane, it will remain in the air, and that faith is grounded on certain evidence and reasons. The faith that people have in God is also grounded in certain evidence and reason. Not just the idea of, well, if you think it hard enough it will happen. That would definitely be idealism. But most religious people are asserting that God exists objectively regardless of whether we think of him or not. This party does not believe that to be an idealistic way of thinking. The actual leap of faith is usually claimed not to be a belief in God which by the religious people is seen as scientific fact, but understanding that a God of such a nature would mean he would have to have communicated with us. So then it's about deciding which revelation, which scripture to believe, and belief applies to what God revealed, but God from a natural perspective is seen as a fact. The jump, therefore, is to whatever specific revelation and whichever specific religion one turns to. If our members are believing that God from a natural perspective is a fact, the process then is one of an acknowledgement of a fact. Whether you think they're wrongly acknowledging a fact is irrelevant, but in terms of the intellectual process, it is the same method as coming to acknowledge any other natural fact. Whether you agree with the final assessment or not, it doesn't matter, but you will have to go and check out the arguments yourself, as you would when reviewing any other scientific fact. Yet regarding methodology, it is absolutely materialist. Of course, There's a possibility someone uses the materialist method and makes the wrong conclusion based upon the incorrect assessment of evidence and their sensible observations, and they reason wrong. But you may personally believe this is what the religious are doing, and that is fine, and we permit this position among our membership. There will likely be some religious people who are indeed idealistic, who do think that in this sort of God of the gaps kind of way. Unfortunately, there is a bell curve in most demographics. I mean, it is really not difficult to find idealistic atheists either, who think that the world bends towards their own ego and they shape reality. Yet, there are certainly atheists who believe in an objective reality, and there are certainly religious who believe in an objective reality. What we specifically do not allow is the assertion that religious belief is necessarily idealistic. Thank you all kindly for your attention, comrades, and I hope this video wasn't too abstract or overwhelming, but it's our first real philosophical video, so you'll have to let us know what you think and if you enjoyed it or not, and I imagine this will provoke some discussion in the comments, and I look forward to reading and interacting with them. So until next time, farewell.
Yeah.